Good morning and welcome to the Pleasure for Health podcast. I'm your host, Elsa Kepi, and I'm really excited today to be finally back online with you regarding something that I think is super interesting and potentially very relevant to our culture today. And that is this idea of codependency, narcissism, helping other people, being triggered. All of this stuff actually kind of comes back to the way that we were originally kind of treated and how we've taken on that role that we may have been put in from an early age. So, this not only relates to us as individuals, but also us as cultures, as society, as cultural groups. We do need to really look at, what are we continuing in these types of actions, and how can we learn to be more tolerant, more whole, more loving and kind and compassionate in a way that will actually help heal our world rather than continuing to divide and make more and more smaller groups fractioned into very divisive sides of an argument, let's say. And I'm not saying that there's easy answers to any of this, but it is helpful to go back and look at, well, how did we get here? How do we get here? How are we continuing to keep ourselves here? So I'm a relationship and intimacy coach along with body worker and owning a retreat center and different things. But I have a lot of interest and also experience working with people and their motivations. And I would say that in this kind of case, if you looked at things like codependency and narcissism and some of the things that seem to be very prevalent in our culture today, we would see that this gets passed on in families. If you have a narcissistic parent who's very self-centered and unable to connect, it often leads to either being very empathic and potentially codependent, or you also become narcissistic and difficult. So these kinds of ways of relating are passed on through family systems, and we need to do some work in order to kind of get out of this. So if we look at some child that grew up and maybe one of their parents was somewhat narcissistic and was seeking to have their child help them to look better. And I think this is fairly common, people want their kids to show that the family is really good, or my child is at Yale, or my child is the champion on the ski team, or whatever. This is partly because we're proud of our child, but potentially partly because it makes us look good as parents if our child is doing well. And so there may be something of, you could say, turning our child into an object in order to make us look better. So if you took this down a route, when my child does well, I talk about them. When they don't do well, I don't talk about that part. So now we're not actually loving and caring about and accepting potentially our child in their holistic, nuances of success and failure and good and bad and, all the things in between. Now we're like, well, this part of you is good and this part of you we're not going to own, right? We don't want to talk about that. So the child would say, well, I get love and I get attention when I do these things well, when I am winning a championship, or when I'm doing well, or when I look good, but otherwise I'm ignored. So then the child then learns to see themselves only in the parts of themselves that are successful, and they ignore their own self in the parts that are not successful. Now you can see how this would very quickly lead to kind of a narcissistic front, like a role archetype. We put something in front of us, this image that we have of ourselves, that we're successful good looking, rich, whatever it is, whatever we've been noticed for, then we put that into our image, and anything else we ignore and we keep in the shadow side of ourselves. And so this happens with groups as well, right? Happens with groups of people. They might see that they have, they get noticed for these particular aspects of the group, and then other aspects nobody wants to look at. They're not considered helpful, and so they're put in the shadow side. So as a group, let's say, this is going to be difficult to pick a group that's not going to be too contentious here, but anyway, let's say I resonate with the group of people that, single moms. Okay, I was a single mom. I can relate to this one. So let's say I relate to that group of single moms, and I get attention for being a single mom that is successfully still raising my children. They are, I'm managing to hold down a job and also cook dinner, all of those types of things. At least most of the time I was. And anything that wasn't working, my sadness about not having a partner or whatever, that was not part of the conversation. We didn't talk about the sadness. We talked about the successes of being a single mom and doing well. And so I could identify with that, and then I would kind of leave behind the rest of the kind of ugly side of being a single parent. And, it's a bit of a shock, actually, when you realize that however good a single parent you are, you're never going to be two parents. Your kids are still going to be missing that part of their experience. And they may have great resilience in certain ways, but they've missed out on other experiences, be it good, bad, or otherwise. And so I've come to see that now that, there was good things and bad things about this. But if I said, well, I'm proud of being a single mom, and now I start looking down on other people because I'm like, wow, those kids had two parents, so of course, whatever I say about that, right? I'm making judgments about other people. And I start taking offense at, the fact that when you're invited to a dinner party, you have to bring an other, or you have to bring a +1 or whatever. Like, maybe I start getting triggered by that. Why can't we just come as our own self? Why do we have to have a partner? And I start getting triggered by all of this. This is, really how group narcissism begins to get created. And we fall into this identification or over-identification with a particular group that we are part of. So if that continues, we have not only our own narcissism about who we are and this projecting of things that we are not acknowledging in ourselves onto other people. Now we have a group narcissism, and we project onto the other people that they're somehow bad, and that somehow people in relationships that have a mom and a dad, or two parents, whatever gender, or however we want to look at that they're somehow have an easier life, and they shouldn't have to fuss about this and that, or they shouldn't have these issues, and they don't have as hard a time as I do as a single parent. And we start making judgments and making an us and them about that as well, because we haven't actually acknowledged the full experience of being a single parent. And the full experience is that it's good and bad, it's hard, and it's sometimes great, and all of the in-betweens. And we start projecting, the things that are hard or not, we don't want to talk about, onto other groups of people. And so now we make an us and them. And it's actually a really strong us and them, because we're actually denying our parts of our own self. And we have, as in the sense that we have to do that, we have to fight really hard to deny those parts of ourselves. So we fight so hard to make the other group wrong, because we don't want to acknowledge it in ourselves. So it's a very interesting thing that happens with not only individuals in relationships when we project our shadow parts of ourselves onto our partner or onto our good friends. Now we project onto other groups. So often we put ourselves in this kind of savior role, or I'm a hero, or I'm a survivor, or whatever. And in doing that, we are rejecting our own wounded part, and we put that onto the other people are wounded, the other people are not so, not whole, the other people haven't found the light, whatever, however we want to say that. And we're the savior, and we've found the answer, and everyone, the other people are wrong. And we stick to this really strongly because we haven't actually acknowledged this part in ourselves, like I said. So where we come from is important, who we are and who we think we are is important to ask ourselves. What groups we identify with is really important to ask ourselves. When I identify with a particular group, like let's say I identify left wing or right wing, or in politics, or let's say I identify as ex-military, or let's say I identify as a spiritual group. These identifications, we want to consider carefully how we make those identifications and why we're not identifying with other groups, and are we then projecting those shadow aspects onto the other group. So if I'm a Christian and I project something onto a Muslim, that's something I want to really look at. If I was the other way around, I was Muslim for a long time, and I projected lots of things onto the unbelievers, right? That was part of the belief system, was that you took that stance that we have the answers and the other people don't. And this is similar to in a relationship. One person says, I know how this could be better. I know what I need to, I know how the household could run better. Why can't you just see it my way? And this is, potentially you could be right, but the point is not to say, well, I'm right and everyone has to agree with me, but to, even acknowledge that there's things that I have right and things that I have wrong, and things that you have right and things that you have wrong. And maybe if we come together and discuss it, we'll end up with more things right and less things wrong together than we would on our own. So what are the stories? What are we doing right now to keep these stories going? Do I have to keep telling myself that my, way of doing things is better? Do I have to keep telling myself that, believing in one God is better than many gods? What am I telling myself that's keeping me in this role of I'm the healed person, or I'm the better person, or I'm whatever, compared to this other thing? So what is the story that I'm telling myself? And, is it possible that there's another story that we could look at, or many other stories we could look at? What am I doing to acknowledge that this story is also within me? So if I'm saying, I have all, one God's better than many gods. Well, where am I also worshiping many gods? And that could be in many ways, right? I worship money, or I worship time, or I worship my job, or I worship like lots of things. I could start looking at how I'm doing that. And the more that I would do that type of work, the less I would be charged up about making the other person out there in the world wrong for having multiple gods themselves, right? And, maybe I would come to a point of like, well, actually, I could see why someone would split this up into many gods, and maybe that's something I could look at as a potential way of being. It doesn't mean that we all have to end up with the same answer, but we need to look at where we're feeling really strongly that someone else is wrong, and figure out where that is in our own self. So what are we trying to do to heal ourselves is to look at the stories and things that we identify with and things that we get triggered over. So I personally find that I still get triggered about, being called a certain political, like aligning with a certain political group. I get charged up about actually both, because I actually get mistaken on both sides. And I don't really like getting pegged, if you will, as either side, because I feel like my views are very complex and I can't really be put into a box with my politics. And so I actually get triggered on both sides. So maybe I have a lot of work to do there to figure out how I could look at the different ways that I'm thinking, and, am I acknowledging the complexity in my own self? Have I put some time into, maybe I have no strong values and I'm, denying that I haven't put in the time to actually make a judgment for myself. What do I believe in? Maybe I see myself as being very open-minded, and then I get annoyed that people peg me as having only one side of a belief because I want to see myself as being open-minded. And so maybe I need to look at the parts of myself that aren't open-minded, right? And actually look at that. So there's lots of healing to do within our own selves if we actually start looking at these triggers as potential for growth. So instead of looking at a trigger and saying, trigger warning, don't let anyone trigger me. If I'm triggered, I'm harmed. Maybe we could switch that up and think, if I'm triggered, that points out something in me that I haven't really completely owned, that I haven't looked at or really embodied or taken into to make a whole part of myself. And in so doing, I'm ending up making smoke and mirrors around who I am and who everyone else is, and I'm not really seeing the truth. And there's many mystical sayings that say something along the lines of, help me to see what the reality is, help me to see what's really present right now. And that's a true prayer. And it's not easy because all of the things we see are so defined by this conditioning that we've had probably since we were born to potentially kind of not own all the parts of ourselves. So it's a little bit of kind of rambling, but I think an important potential thought process to be going through, and to be really pondering where you do get triggered. When do you feel a little hot under the collar when someone says, oh, you're this, right? And maybe you don't want to be that, or maybe you do. Either way, when are you really happy that, oh, you're so whatever people say? Like, does that make you really happy? Does it make you really angry? Does it make you, upset? If that's the case, there's something there to be grateful for actually having someone point out. And maybe this is something that you could take for your day and ponder and really see if there's something about how that could be healed in you. And so therefore we become, instead of codependent on lots of others to show up our shadow sides, we actually take in our own shadow and become more whole in ourselves. Therefore, not needing the world to point all these triggers out and to be so much showing us our shadow, potentially we could create a much nicer world if we're all doing this type of work. So it's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not very sexy as far as the work that has to be done, but I do think it's entirely within our potential to actually take this on. And in such a time as we find ourselves, I think it's extremely important. So I hope that you've enjoyed this little chat, that it's given you some ideas. Again, please do reach out if you have comments, questions, or you want to look up more about me or my work. You can find my website at www.pleasureforhealth.com. I'd be happy to continue this discussion. So drop your comments. Let me know how you enjoyed the podcast, and I'll talk to you all soon.